Mr. Brooks, if you're as good as your file says, tell me what's wrong with this equation. Professor Grant Whitmore's voice carried across the lecture hall with the clean confidence of a man who had spent 32 years being the smartest person in the room. 40 students turned toward Elijah Brooks before he even looked up. At the front of the room, beneath the white glare of fluorescent lights, Whitmore stood beside a blackboard covered in symbols, one hand resting against the wooden ledge, the other holding a piece of chalk between two fingers. Written in the center was a familiar expression: the square of a plus b equals a squared plus 2ab plus b squared. Simple enough to anyone who had survived high school algebra. That was exactly why several students smiled. Elijah didn't. He sat 3 rows from the back in a faded navy sweatshirt, his notebook open, his pencil motionless above a page crowded with equations. He looked at the board for 3 seconds. Then 5. Whitmore raised an eyebrow. Well, a quiet laugh slipped from somewhere near the front row. Elijah heard it. He had heard versions of that laugh before, usually after someone learned he was 19, on scholarship, and enrolled in an honors course most freshmen never entered. He closed his notebook carefully. Which mistake, sir? The laughter grew louder for half a second, then stopped when Whitmore's expression changed. Which mistake? Whitmore repeated. You believe there's more than one? Elijah stood. His chair made a soft scrape against the floor. I believe the answer depends on what A and B are. Whitmore folded his arms. They're matrices. Elijah nodded once. That confirmed it. He stepped into the aisle. The room suddenly felt smaller, as if every desk had tilted toward him. Sophie Miller, the graduate teaching assistant near the side wall, stopped typing on her laptop. Whitmore watched Elijah approach the board with an expression that was almost amused. You understand this is an honors algebra class, Mr. Brooks? Yes, sir. Then you understand I didn't ask for a philosophical answer. Elijah reached the front. The chalkboard smelled faintly of dust and old wood. A thin white powder coated the ledge beneath Whitmore's equation. Elijah picked up a fresh piece of chalk. It's not philosophical. Whitmore's smile tightened. Then fix it. Elijah looked once more at the expression. To most of the room, it looked ordinary. To him, the problem wasn't what had been written. It was what Whitmore had quietly assumed. Elijah lifted the chalk and wrote beneath the equation, a squared plus ab plus ba plus b squared. The chalk clicked softly against the board. Someone shifted in a seat behind him. Elijah underlined ab, then ba. Whitmore's arms slowly unfolded. Explain. Elijah turned around. His heartbeat was faster now, but his voice stayed level. You combine these two terms. He pointed at the board. That only works if AB equals BA. Whitmore stared at him. And Elijah set the chalk against the board again. And with matrices, sir, they don't always commute. The room went completely quiet. No laughter. No whispering. Just the faint hum of the ventilation system and the chalk between Elijah's fingers. Whitmore glanced at the equation, then back at the 19-year-old student he had called out in front of everyone. You're sure? Elijah paused. No, sir. A few faces turned toward one another. Whitmore's smile returned. Then Elijah finished the sentence. That's why I'm going to prove it. 3 weeks earlier, Elijah Brooks had arrived at Hawthorne University carrying everything he owned for the semester in one worn duffel bag, one backpack, and a cardboard box taped twice across the bottom. The campus looked almost unreal to him that morning. All red brick buildings, trimmed lawns, stone arches, and students moving between orientation tables with parents beside them and car trunks still open along the curb. Elijah had come alone on the city bus. His mother had wanted to drive him, but her shift at the rehabilitation center started before sunrise, and missing a day meant losing money they could not afford to lose. So Elijah had hugged her in their apartment kitchen at 5:30 that morning, promised to call after registration, and left with a travel mug of coffee she had made too sweet because she knew he would forget to eat. By noon, he was standing outside the mathematics building beneath a bronze plaque bearing the names of donors whose last names also seemed to appear on libraries, scholarships, and lecture halls. Elijah checked his schedule again. Honors Algebra, Professor Grant Whitmore, room 214. He had read Whitmore's papers before he had ever imagined meeting him. In high school, while other students prepared for standardized tests, Elijah spent late nights borrowing university textbooks from the public library, filling cheap spiral notebooks with proofs he sometimes understood only after 3 or 4 attempts. Mathematics made sense to him in a way people often did not. Numbers did not glance at his clothes. Equations did not ask where he lived. A proof either held or it failed. That simplicity had always felt like freedom. Room 214 changed that feeling almost immediately. The class was smaller than he expected, filled mostly with upperclassmen who already seemed to know one another. Elijah took a seat near the back and placed his old laptop on the desk. Its left hinge had been repaired with black electrical tape. Two students nearby glanced at it, then at him. One leaned toward the other and whispered something Elijah could not hear. He did hear the last two words. Diversity scholarship. Elijah kept his eyes on his notebook. A minute later, Professor Whitmore entered carrying no notes. He wrote his name on the board, turned, and scanned the room. His gaze stopped on Elijah for just a moment longer than it stopped anywhere else. Freshman, Whitmore asked. Elijah nodded. Yes, sir. Whitmore looked at the roster. Brooks. It was not a question. You completed the prerequisite? Yes, sir. At a public high school. Elijah felt several heads turn. Yes, sir. Whitmore gave a small nod and moved on, but the question stayed in the room longer than his voice did. Over the next 3 weeks, Elijah noticed a pattern. When other students hesitated, Whitmore offered hints. When Elijah hesitated, Whitmore asked whether he understood the material. When someone else made a mistake, it became part of the lesson. When Elijah made one, Whitmore stared at him as though confirming something he already believed. Elijah never complained. He answered what he could, studied what he could not, and returned every morning with another page of notes. Then, on a cold Thursday in October, Professor Whitmore entered room 214 with a piece of chalk already in his hand, looked directly at Elijah, and decided to test him. Grant Whitmore had spent 32 years building a reputation that made nervous students sit straighter before he even entered the room. His office on the 4th floor reflected that reputation with almost mathematical precision. Framed conference photographs lined one wall. Academic awards filled another. 3 shelves held books with his name printed across the spine, and on the desk sat a silver fountain pen given to him after his 20th year at Hawthorne University. Nothing in the room looked accidental. Whitmore liked order. He trusted systems, rankings, credentials, and the quiet hierarchy of people who had proven they belonged. Every semester, he reminded his honors students of the same principle. Mathematics does not care who you are. A proof is either correct or it is not. Students repeated the line years after graduation. Some quoted it in recommendation letters. Others wrote it beneath photographs taken at commencement. Whitmore believed it completely, or at least he believed that he did. That Thursday morning, before walking into room 214, he had sat at his desk reviewing the class roster beside a cup of black coffee that had already gone cold. Elijah Brooks's name appeared near the bottom. 19 years old. First-year student. Full academic scholarship. Public high school. Exceptional placement scores. Whitmore read the numbers twice. Then he opened Elijah's first 3 assignments. Nearly perfect. The mistakes were small and unusual, not the careless errors of someone struggling with the material, but the kind produced by a student thinking beyond the method being taught. On one problem, Elijah had solved the proof using an approach Whitmore had not introduced. In the margin, Whitmore had written, "Use the assigned method." Elijah had done so on the next page without complaint. Whitmore should have been curious. Instead, a different thought had settled quietly behind his eyes. Too polished. Too advanced. Perhaps someone had helped him. Perhaps the placement exam had been a fortunate day. Perhaps the admissions office had been eager to place a scholarship student into a prestigious program. Whitmore never said those thoughts aloud. He did not need to. They shaped the questions he asked and the patience he offered. When Sophie Miller, his graduate assistant, stepped into the office carrying attendance sheets, she noticed Elijah's file open on the desk. "He is good," she said. Whitmore looked up. "He is prepared." "No," Sophie replied. "He is good." Whitmore leaned back in his chair. 3 weeks is not enough time to know that. Sophie glanced at the marked assignments. 3 weeks seems to have been enough time for you to doubt it. The room went still. Whitmore removed his glasses and folded them carefully beside the coffee cup. "I doubt everyone." Sophie gave him a look that lasted 1 second too long. Not the same way. She left the attendance sheets on his desk and walked out. Whitmore sat alone afterward, listening to the soft ticking of the clock above his shelves. He could have dismissed the conversation. He nearly did. Instead, He looked again at Elijah's work, then reached for a piece of chalk from the small box he kept beside his books. By the time he entered room 214, he had decided on a test. Not an examination printed on paper. Not something every student would take. One equation, one student, one opportunity, Whitmore told himself, to find out whether Elijah Brooks truly belonged. What Whitmore did not understand yet was that the test had already revealed something important, and Elijah had not even touched the chalk. The difference was never dramatic enough for anyone to point at it and call it unfair. That was what made it easy to miss. On Monday, Daniel Mercer forgot a definition halfway through a proof, and Professor Whitmore smiled patiently. Take your time. Start with what you know. Daniel found his way back to the answer and received a nod of approval. On Tuesday, Claire Bennett confused two conditions in a theorem, and Whitmore walked her through the distinction step by step until she corrected herself. That is why we check our assumptions, he told the class. Then Wednesday came. Elijah was working through a problem involving linear transformations when he paused for perhaps 2 seconds, his pencil hovering above his notebook. Whitmore noticed immediately. Mr. Brooks, are we moving too quickly? Elijah looked up. No, sir. You seem uncertain. I was checking whether the transformation is one-to-one. Whitmore tilted his head. That was covered in the prerequisite course. A few students shifted in their seats. Elijah felt the familiar heat rise along the back of his neck, but his voice remained even. Yes, sir. I completed that course. Whitmore held his gaze. Then you should know the answer. Elijah looked back at the board, followed the mapping through the basis vectors, and gave the correct result. Whitmore simply turned away and continued the lecture. No nod. No acknowledgement. Just the dry scrape of chalk moving across the blackboard. Sophie Miller saw it. She had been sitting near the side wall with a stack of quizzes in her lap, and for the rest of class, she watched Whitmore more closely than the equations. Elijah did not look toward her. He had learned early that reacting to small humiliations often gave them more life than they deserved. His mother had taught him something similar when he was 12, after a teacher had assumed a science project could not have been his because it was too advanced. You do not have to shrink to make somebody comfortable with being wrong about you, she had told him. Elijah had remembered that sentence for 7 years. So he kept coming to class. He kept arriving 10 minutes early. He kept filling page after page with careful notes. When Whitmore asked difficult questions, Elijah answered them. When Whitmore asked questions that felt less like teaching and more like checking whether Elijah had somehow slipped through a locked door, Elijah answered those too. The strangest part was that Whitmore seemed almost disappointed each time he did. By Thursday morning, the temperature outside had dropped into the low 40s, and students entered room 214, rubbing their hands together beneath jackets and hoodies. Elijah took his usual seat and opened his notebook. Whitmore arrived exactly at 9, placed his coffee on the desk, and began discussing matrix multiplication. 20 minutes into the lecture, he stopped. There is something useful about fundamentals, he said, looking across the room. They expose whether someone understands mathematics or merely memorizes it. His eyes settled on Elijah. Sophie stopped writing. Whitmore erased the center of the board slowly, leaving a dark rectangle surrounded by pale chalk dust. Then he wrote a familiar algebraic expansion, stepped aside, and studied Elijah with a calm expression. Mr. Brooks, he said, perhaps you can show us how solid your fundamentals really are. Elijah looked at the equation. Then he looked at Whitmore. In that moment, he understood something the rest of the class did not. This was not a random question. Whitmore had built a trap, and he had built it specifically for him. Whitmore let the silence settle before he spoke again. This should be straightforward. His tone was mild, almost casual, but Elijah could hear the challenge beneath it. The equation on the board looked harmless at first glance, the kind of expression students learned years before college, and that was exactly what made it dangerous. Whitmore had placed it inside a lesson on matrices, where familiar rules did not always behave the way they did with ordinary numbers. Elijah studied the symbols without moving. Across the room, Daniel Mercer leaned back in his chair with the faint smile of someone expecting a quick mistake. Claire Bennett glanced from the board to Elijah, then lowered her eyes to her notebook. Sophie Miller did neither. She watched Whitmore. Well, Mr. Brooks? Whitmore asked. Would you like more time? Elijah looked at him. No, sir. Then tell us whether the expansion is correct. Elijah could have answered immediately. He knew the issue the moment he saw it. But something about Whitmore's expression made him slow down. The professor was not asking for help solving a problem. He already knew the problem. He had written it this way on purpose. Elijah looked again at the equation, then at the rows of students waiting behind him. For 3 weeks, Whitmore had questioned his preparation in small, careful ways. Now he had created a moment where one wrong answer could turn every quiet doubt into public evidence. Elijah felt his heartbeat against his ribs, steady but heavy. He remembered his mother's voice from years earlier. Do not shrink just because somebody is comfortable being wrong about you. He closed his notebook. Whitmore raised an eyebrow. Something wrong? Yes, sir. A few students looked up. Whitmore gestured toward the board. With the equation? Elijah stood. With the assumption. The smile on Daniel's face faded slightly. Whitmore remained still. That is a confident answer. It is a mathematical one. Sophie lowered the papers in her lap. Whitmore picked up another piece of chalk and held it toward Elijah. Then perhaps you should explain it to the class. Elijah walked down the aisle. Each step seemed louder than it should have been against the polished floor. When he reached the front, Whitmore did not move far enough away to make the invitation feel generous. Elijah took the chalk anyway. Fine white dust coated his fingertips almost immediately. Before you change anything, Whitmore said, tell me what you think I did wrong. Elijah looked at the 2 middle terms in the expansion. You treated matrix multiplication as though order does not matter. Whitmore's expression sharpened. Does it? Sometimes. A quiet chuckle came from somewhere behind Elijah. Whitmore heard it too. Sometimes is not a proof, Mr. Brooks. Elijah nodded. I agree. He turned toward the board and wrote the multiplication out 1 step at a time, refusing to skip the part Whitmore had expected him to overlook. First A multiplied by A, then A multiplied by B, then B multiplied by A, then B multiplied by B. When Elijah finished, the 2 middle terms sat beside each other like twins that only looked identical from a distance. He tapped the chalk beneath them. You can combine these only if A times B equals B times A. Whitmore folded his arms. And you believe they are not equal? Elijah glanced back at him. I do not believe it, Professor. I can show it. Elijah turned back to the board and drew 2 small square arrays of numbers beneath the expression, choosing examples simple enough that no one in the room could hide behind complexity. Let it be the matrix with 1 in the upper right corner and zeros everywhere else, he said. His voice stayed calm, almost conversational. Let B be the matrix with 1 in the lower left corner and zeros everywhere else. Whitmore watched without interrupting. Elijah multiplied A by B first, writing each step carefully so the class could follow. The result placed a 1 in the upper left position. Then he reversed the order and multiplied B by A. This time, the 1 appeared in the lower right position. 2 products. 2 different answers. Elijah stepped aside. A times B does not equal B times A. The room became so quiet that the faint buzzing from the ceiling lights seemed louder. Sophie Miller leaned forward, her eyes moving between the 2 products. Daniel Mercer stopped smiling. Claire Bennett lifted her head from her notebook. Whitmore stared at the board, and for the first time since Elijah had entered the class 3 weeks earlier, the professor did not seem to have an immediate response prepared. Elijah pointed to the original expansion. So if you write 2A times B in the middle, you are assuming the 2 products are interchangeable. They are not interchangeable in general. Whitmore took 1 step closer. You chose a special example. A counterexample only needs to work once to disprove a general claim. Sophie looked down quickly, but Elijah caught the beginning of a smile on her face. Whitmore heard the answer and pressed his lips together. And if the matrices do commute, then your expansion is correct. Elijah lowered the chalk. But you did not state that condition. The words were not loud. They did not need to be. Whitmore looked at the sentence he had written above the equation, then at the counterexample beneath it. The chalk dust on the board made the clean black surface look almost gray around Elijah's work. For several seconds, no one moved. Then Whitmore reached toward the board. Elijah expected him to erase the example. Instead, the professor picked up a different piece of chalk and wrote 1 word beside the original expression. Condition. So, Whitmore said slowly, your objection is not to the algebra itself. It is to the missing assumption. Elijah nodded. Yes, sir. And you noticed that immediately? Elijah hesitated. He could feel the attention of every student in the room now, but the attention had changed. It no longer felt like curiosity about whether he would fail. "I noticed the order," he said. The rest followed. Whitmore studied him with an expression Elijah could not read. Pride had not left the professor's face, but certainty had. That was new. Whitmore turned back toward the board and began reviewing Elijah's steps from the beginning, checking each multiplication as though searching for a hidden flaw. He did not find one. Sophie stood and walked closer, then quietly verified the products herself. "He is right," she said. Whitmore looked at her, then at Elijah. "I can see that." It should have ended there. Elijah should have returned to his seat, the class should have moved on, and Whitmore should have converted the moment into another lesson. But as Elijah reached for the eraser, his eyes drifted toward the right side of the blackboard, where Whitmore had already written the next theorem for the lecture. Elijah stopped. The chalk remained in his hand. Something in the professor's next line looked familiar for all the wrong reasons. Whitmore noticed the pause. "What is it now, Mr. Brooks?" Elijah stared at the theorem for another second. "Professor, I think you used the same assumption again." Whitmore followed Elijah's gaze to the theorem on the right side of the board. The expression had been written 20 minutes earlier, before anyone knew the morning would become something more than another lecture. For a moment, the professor said nothing. Then he placed the chalk on the ledge with deliberate care. "That statement is not the same problem." Elijah nodded. "No, sir. But the proof uses the same step." A small movement passed through the room as students turned toward the second half of the board. The atmosphere had changed. 10 minutes earlier, they had been waiting to see whether Elijah would embarrass himself. Now notebooks were open, pencils moving, eyes tracing every symbol Whitmore had written. Sophie Miller walked closer. "Which line?" she asked. Elijah pointed near the middle of the proof. "There." When the two operators switch order, Whitmore immediately responded. "That rearrangement is justified by the structure we established earlier." Elijah looked at the previous line. "Only if the operators commute." Whitmore's jaw tightened. "There are additional conditions involved." "I know." Elijah lifted the chalk again. "That is why I did not say the theorem was wrong. I said the assumption appears again." Sophie stepped beside the board and studied the proof. The fluorescent lights reflected faintly across her glasses. Daniel Mercer had stopped leaning back in his chair. He was writing now, copying the relevant lines as quickly as he could. Claire Bennett whispered something to the student beside her, but the other student only shook his head, eyes still fixed forward. Whitmore reached for the chalk. "Let us be precise." His voice remained controlled, but the warmth had disappeared from it. He rewrote the disputed transformation slowly, explaining each condition as he went. Elijah listened without interrupting. The professor reached the line Elijah had questioned and paused. The chalk hovered less than an inch from the board. He wrote one symbol, stopped, erased it, then tried another route. 30 seconds passed. No one spoke. Whitmore tried again. The proof moved forward for 2 lines before arriving at the same obstacle. Sophie looked down at her notes. "Professor," she said carefully, "he may have a point." Whitmore turned toward her. "May." Sophie walked to the board, took a piece of chalk, and marked the 2 operators. "You are exchanging their order here. Unless there is a condition from the previous lemma that I am missing, the step does not follow automatically." Whitmore stared at the marks. Elijah felt something strange in the room then, not triumph and not satisfaction. It was recognition. The students were no longer watching a professor test a freshman. They were watching mathematics do what Whitmore always claimed mathematics did. It did not care about titles. It did not care who had published books, who sat in the back row, or whose laptop was held together with electrical tape. A statement either held or it did not. Whitmore slowly turned toward Elijah. "How far did you follow this before you raised your hand?" Elijah glanced at the theorem. "Far enough to know I could not justify that step." "You have seen this proof before?" "No, sir." That answer seemed to disturb Whitmore more than anything else. Sophie looked at Elijah. "You saw it just now?" "Yes." Daniel stopped writing. Whitmore's eyes moved from Elijah to the board, then back again. The room waited for him to acknowledge what everyone could now see. Instead, he straightened his shoulders. "We are not going to derail the lecture over an observation that has not been fully checked." Elijah lowered the chalk. "Then we should check it." Whitmore's face hardened. "Sit down, Mr. Brooks." The words landed softly, but the silence afterward made them feel much heavier. Elijah looked at the unfinished proof, placed the chalk on the ledge, and returned to his seat. Behind him, nobody laughed. Elijah returned to his seat without looking at anyone. The walk back felt longer than the walk to the board, even though it was only a few yards. He sat down, opened his notebook, and placed his pencil beside the page instead of writing. At the front of the room, Professor Whitmore continued the lecture as though nothing unusual had happened, but his rhythm had changed. He spoke faster. He erased the disputed section of the proof before moving to the next topic. Sophie Miller noticed. So did several students. Nobody said anything. The next 20 minutes passed beneath a strange pressure, every sentence from Whitmore sounding carefully measured, every movement of chalk against the board sharper than before. Elijah kept his eyes forward. He was not angry in the way Whitmore might have expected. Anger would have been easier. What bothered him was the familiar feeling underneath it, the sense that being correct had somehow created a new problem because he was the person who had been correct. When the class ended, chairs scraped back and backpacks zipped shut, but students moved more slowly than usual. Daniel Mercer passed Elijah's desk and stopped. "Hey," he said quietly. Elijah looked up. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. That counterexample was clean. It was not an apology, but it was something. "Thanks," Elijah said. Claire Bennett gave him a small nod on her way out. Sophie remained near the front, organizing papers she had already organized twice. Whitmore stood beside his desk, placing chalk into the wooden tray one piece at a time. Elijah packed his laptop into his bag. As he reached the door, Sophie called his name. "Elijah." He turned. Whitmore looked up too. Sophie hesitated, then asked, "How did you notice the second issue?" Elijah glanced toward the board, where faint white traces of the erased proof still remained. "The first mistake made me watch the order more carefully. That is all. Mostly." Sophie smiled slightly. Most first-year students would not have seen it. Whitmore closed the lid of his briefcase. "We do not know yet whether there is anything to see." Elijah looked at him. For 3 weeks, he had answered every challenge with respect. He did the same now. Then checking it should settle that. Whitmore's expression tightened. "Research mathematics is not a classroom exercise, Mr. Brooks. There are dependencies you have not studied yet." That may be true. Elijah adjusted the strap of his backpack. But if the step is valid, there should be a reason. Sophie said nothing. Whitmore stared at Elijah for several seconds. The old wall clock above the door clicked once. "I will review it," he finally said. Elijah nodded. "Thank you, Professor." He left the room and walked down the corridor toward the stairwell, where tall windows looked out over wet sidewalks and orange leaves scattered across the campus lawn. Behind him, room 214 remained open. Sophie waited until Elijah's footsteps disappeared before turning to Whitmore. "You knew the first equation was wrong when you wrote it." Whitmore did not answer. "You chose him on purpose. I wanted to test his understanding. Would you have done that to Daniel?" Whitmore picked up his coffee, discovered it was cold, and set it down again. Sophie gathered her papers. "You always say mathematics does not care who someone is." She glanced toward the erased proof. "Maybe that is why you should listen when it tells you that you are wrong." After she left, Whitmore stood alone in the empty classroom. Late morning light fell across the board, revealing ghostly streaks where the second proof had been erased. He opened his briefcase, pulled out a thick research manuscript, and found the page containing the same argument. His eyes stopped on one line, then the next. Slowly, the confidence drained from his face. The step Elijah had questioned was there too. Whitmore did not leave room 214 when the building emptied for lunch. He carried the manuscript to the front row, sat beneath the cold fluorescent lights, and began checking the argument from the beginning. At first, he expected to find the condition Elijah had missed. A hidden lemma, a restriction stated 20 pages earlier. Some technical assumption obvious to an experienced mathematician but invisible to a first-year student. Whitmore turned pages slowly, tracing references with the silver pen he normally reserved for final revisions. Nothing. He opened his laptop and pulled up an earlier draft. The same step was there. He checked the notes from a seminar he had given 6 months earlier. Again, the operators changed order without justification. By 3 in the afternoon, his coffee had been replaced twice and remained untouched both times. Outside the tall classroom windows, students crossed the wet campus under gray October skies, carrying umbrellas and backpacks, unaware that one of Hawthorne University's most respected professors was sitting alone with a problem a 19-year-old freshman had noticed in less than a minute. Whitmore wrote the disputed expression on a clean page. He tried proving the missing commutation property directly. The argument failed. He tried restricting the domain. That worked, but only for a narrower class of operators than his manuscript claimed. He tried a different representation and reached the same obstruction. Each failed route left another line of ink across the yellow legal pad beside him. By 5:30, the classroom lights had switched automatically to evening mode, leaving the corners of the room dimmer. Whitmore moved upstairs to his office. The framed awards on the wall looked different somehow. Not smaller, just quieter. He opened the manuscript again. Friday's conference presentation was less than 24 hours away. Months of work depended on the theorem being stated correctly. The result was not worthless, but it was not what he had claimed. The general proof failed. Elijah had been right. Whitmore leaned back and closed his eyes. The thought should have been purely mathematical. Instead, another memory returned. Elijah is standing at the board with chalk on his fingers. Daniel's quiet laugh. Whitmore asking whether a public high school had prepared him. Sophie saying, "Not the same way." Whitmore opened his eyes and looked toward Elijah's file still resting on the corner of his desk. He pulled it closer. This time he read past the summary page. State Mathematics Competition Finalist at 17. Independent study in abstract algebra. Perfect score on the university placement examination. A recommendation letter from Elijah's high school teacher described a student who regularly stayed after class to solve problems beyond the curriculum, then spent Saturday mornings tutoring younger students without pay. Whitmore stopped reading. He had possessed all of this information from the beginning. He simply had not treated it as evidence with the same weight he gave his own suspicion. At 7:42, Sophie appeared in the doorway carrying her coat. "You are still here." Whitmore turned the legal pad toward her. She read the calculations silently. "He was right," she said. Whitmore nodded. "The theorem holds under a stronger restriction, but not generally." Sophie looked at him. "Does that affect tomorrow?" "Yes." Whitmore rubbed his forehead. "I will have to revise the presentation." Sophie studied his face for a moment. "Are you going to tell Elijah?" Whitmore looked toward the dark window. "I told him I would review it." "That was not what I asked." Before he could answer, his computer made a soft sound. A new email had arrived. The sender was Elijah Brooks. Whitmore opened it. There was no accusation in the message. No complaint. Only one sentence. "Professor Whitmore, I worked through the operator condition after class, and I think there may be a way to preserve the main result if you narrow the hypothesis." Beneath it was an attachment. 11 pages. Whitmore clicked the attachment and leaned closer to the screen. 11 pages opened beneath Elijah's name, dense with notation but organized with unusual clarity. The first page restated the problem without drama. The second isolated the exact point where the operators changed order. By the third, Elijah had introduced a narrower condition that preserved the structure Whitmore needed. Sophie moved behind his chair and read silently over his shoulder. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. The office seemed to shrink around the glow of the monitor, the shelves, awards, and framed photographs fading into the darkness beyond the desk lamp. Whitmore reached for a legal pad and began checking each step by hand. Elijah had not merely pointed out the flaw. He had rebuilt the argument around it. One lemma became two. A general statement became a restricted one. The conclusion survived, but only after the assumptions were made honest. Whitmore tested the first page. Correct. He tested the second. Correct. By page 6, he stopped expecting the mistake that would restore the old balance of the room. By page 9, his silver pen had gone still in his hand. Sophie broke the silence. He did this after class? Whitmore looked at the timestamp. The email had been sent at 7:38 that evening. Apparently. Sophie glanced toward the stack of abandoned calculations on his desk. "How long have you been working on it?" Whitmore did not answer. He turned to the final page. Elijah had written a short note beneath the last line of the proof. "The stronger claim appears to fail, but the main result should hold under this hypothesis." No celebration. No accusation. No reminder of what had happened in room 214. Just mathematics. Whitmore read the sentence twice. Then he opened Elijah's original homework again and compared the style. The same economy was there. The same habit of checking hidden assumptions. The same willingness to take a longer route if it made the reasoning cleaner. For 3 weeks, Whitmore had treated those qualities as reasons for suspicion. Now the evidence sat 11 pages deep on his screen. I thought he was trying to impress people, Whitmore said quietly. Sophie looked at him. Was he? Whitmore stared at the proof. No. The answer came slowly. I think he was trying to make the argument correct. Outside the office window, the campus had gone nearly dark. A maintenance cart moved along the sidewalk below, its small amber light passing between the trees. Whitmore checked the clock. 2:13 in the morning. His conference presentation was scheduled for 9:30. The original slides were unusable. He should have felt panic. Instead, he felt something heavier. Shame had a strange precision when there was nowhere left to hide from it. He remembered calling Elijah out in front of the class. He remembered the quiet laughter. He remembered asking about his public high school, questioning his prerequisites, treating every correct answer as though it required extra verification. Whitmore had spent his career insisting that proof mattered more than assumption. Yet with Elijah, he had reversed the rule. Sophie closed the office door softly behind her coat. What are you going to do tomorrow? Whitmore looked at the 11 pages again. First, I fixed the presentation. He paused. Then I fixed something harder. By sunrise, the revised theorem carried a new condition, a new proof, and a line Whitmore had never expected to type beneath his own name. Inside on the correction provided by Elijah Brooks, first-year student, Hawthorne University. By 8:15 the next morning, Hawthorne University was already awake, but Elijah Brooks looked as though he had barely slept. He sat alone near the back of the student union with a paper cup of coffee cooling beside his notebook, rereading the final page of the proof he had sent the night before. Outside the tall windows, the October sky had cleared into a pale blue, and students crossed the quad under jackets zipped against the morning chill. Elijah had considered deleting the email 3 times before sending it. Not because he doubted the mathematics, because he understood exactly what the correction could do. He could have copied Dr. Rebecca Lawson, the mathematics department chair. He could have forwarded the flawed argument to other students. He could have mentioned what happened in room 214 and allowed the story to spread on its own. Professor Whitmore was presenting the theorem that morning before visiting faculty, graduate students, and researchers from across the region. A public mistake there would have traveled far beyond one classroom. Elijah knew that. He had known it when he pressed send. That was why the message had gone to one person. Whitmore. Nothing else. Elijah was closing his notebook when a shadow stopped beside the table. He looked up. Professor Whitmore stood there wearing the same charcoal suit he usually reserved for conferences, but something about him seemed less polished than usual. His eyes were tired. His tie had been loosened slightly. In one hand, he carried a leather folder thick with revised pages. Mr. Brooks. Elijah straightened. Professor. Whitmore glanced at the empty chair across from him. May I? Elijah nodded. Whitmore sat. For several seconds, neither spoke. The noise of the student union moved around them, espresso machines hissing, chairs sliding, conversations rising and fading. Whitmore placed the folder on the table. I checked all 11 pages. Elijah waited. Your restriction works. Whitmore opened the folder and turned it toward him. The theorem survives in a narrower form. The original statement does not. Elijah looked at the revised pages. His name appeared beneath the theorem in smaller print. He blinked once. You did not have to add that. Yes, Whitmore said. I did. Elijah looked at him. Whitmore rested both hands on the table. Why did you send it only to me? The question surprised Elijah more than the acknowledgement. Because you were presenting today. That is not what I asked. Elijah looked down at his coffee. I knew what you meant. Whitmore leaned back slightly. You could have embarrassed me. Elijah's eyes lifted. Would that have made the proof better? Whitmore did not answer. Elijah closed the folder gently. I was angry yesterday. His voice stayed quiet. Not because you challenged my math. You should challenge my math. That is the class. He paused. I was angry because it felt like you had decided what I was before I ever answered anything. Whitmore's face changed, almost imperceptibly. Elijah continued. But if I used your mistake to humiliate you, then I would be doing the same kind of thing. I would be deciding what you deserve before giving you a chance to correct it. The words settled between them. Whitmore stared at the untouched coffee cup near Elijah's hand. You are more generous than I was. Elijah shook his head. It is not generosity. Then what is it? Elijah looked toward the windows, where sunlight had begun touching the wet brick paths outside. The math was wrong, so I tried to fix the math. Whitmore lowered his eyes. For years, He had believed intelligence revealed itself through answers. Sitting across from Elijah, he understood that character sometimes revealed itself through what a person chose not to do. He gathered the revised pages and stood. The conference begins in an hour. Elijah nodded. Whitmore hesitated. I would like you there. Elijah looked surprised. Why? Whitmore met his eyes. Because if I am going to present the corrected result, the room should know who saw what I did not. The conference room on the third floor of Hawthorne Hall was nearly full by 9:20. Faculty members filled the first rows, graduate students stood along the walls, and visiting researchers settled into folding chairs with notebooks open on their laps. Elijah chose a seat near the back. He had almost refused to come. Nothing about the room felt designed for a 19-year-old freshman in a faded navy sweatshirt, especially one whose laptop was still held together with black electrical tape. But Professor Whitmore had asked him to be there, and something in the way he asked had made Elijah believe the invitation mattered. At 9:30, Whitmore stepped behind the lectern. His first slides moved exactly as expected. Definitions, prior results, the central theorem. Then he stopped before the slide containing the original proof. His hand rested on the remote. Before I continue, he said, I need to correct the record. The room became still. Whitmore changed the slide. Elijah saw the revised hypothesis appear on the screen, followed by the corrected argument. Beneath it, in clear text, was his name. A few people leaned forward. Dr. Rebecca Lawson, seated in the front row, looked from the screen to Whitmore. The original statement was too broad, Whitmore continued. I used a commutation step that I had not justified. Yesterday, a student identified the problem during class. He looked toward the back of the room. Elijah Brooks, would you stand for a moment? Elijah froze. Every instinct told him to remain seated, but Sophie, standing near the aisle, gave him a small nod. Elijah stood. Heads turned. Whitmore did not smile. He seemed determined to make every word exact. Mr. Brooks did more than identify the flaw. He developed a restriction that preserves the main result and sent me a complete argument last night. He did so privately, when he had every opportunity to make my mistake public before I could correct it. The room remained silent. Elijah felt heat rise into his face. Whitmore looked down briefly, then back at the audience. There is another correction I need to make, and it has nothing to do with the theorem. Dr. Lawson straightened in her chair. Whitmore took a slow breath. I questioned Mr. Brooks more aggressively than I questioned other students. I told myself I was testing rigor. I was not being equally rigorous with everyone. I had made assumptions about whether he belonged in an advanced classroom before I had given his work the respect it had earned. No one moved. The quiet felt heavier than applause could have been. Whitmore turned toward Elijah. I was wrong. Elijah held his gaze. And when you proved me wrong, I still tried to protect my pride before I protected the truth. Whitmore stepped away from the lectern. For that, I apologize. Elijah did not answer immediately. The projector cast a pale rectangle of light across the wall behind Whitmore. Finally, Elijah said, I did not need you to stop challenging me, Professor. His voice carried farther than he expected. I needed you to challenge the work before you challenged whether I belonged. Whitmore nodded once. You are right. Elijah looked around the room, then back at him. Next time, test the math, not the person. For several seconds, there was only silence. Then Dr. Lawson closed her notebook. Whitmore looked at the corrected theorem glowing on the screen, then at Elijah standing in the back row. The professor had entered the room prepared to defend a result. Instead, he had done something harder. He had admitted that the most important correction was not written in the proof. By the time winter gave way to early spring, room 214 no longer felt like the place where Elijah had once been asked to prove that he belonged. The same blackboard stretched across the front wall. The same fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The same wooden ledge still collected a thin line of white chalk dust after every lecture. But something in the room had changed. Professor Whitmore had changed. He still challenged students. He still interrupted weak arguments and demanded complete proofs. He still believed precision mattered. The difference was in what happened before judgment. He listened. When Daniel made an error, Whitmore asked him to examine the assumption. When Claire hesitated, he gave her time. When Elijah questioned a step, Whitmore no longer treated the question as a threat. He turned toward the board and said, Show me. Months after the conference, Dr. Rebecca Lawson approved a small undergraduate research project based on the corrected theorem. Whitmore could have let it alone. Instead, he asked Elijah to work beside him. Not beneath him, beside him. On a cool March afternoon, faculty members and students gathered in room 214 for Elijah's first formal research presentation. His mother sat in the second row wearing the blue sweater she saved for special occasions, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Sophie Miller stood near the wall with a quiet smile. Elijah walked to the front carrying no laptop, only a notebook and one piece of chalk. His old computer was still in his backpack, the black electrical tape still wrapped around the hinge. He had never replaced it. Somehow he liked the reminder. Whitmore introduced him with fewer words than people expected. Elijah Brooks found a question worth asking. Today, he will show you where it led. Then the professor stepped aside. Elijah looked at the board. For a second, he remembered the first time he had stood there, 40 faces waiting for him to fail. Whitmore watching with suspicion, chalk dust drying against his fingertips. Now the room waited for a different reason. Elijah began. He explained the restricted condition, then the structure that followed from it. His voice was steady. When someone interrupted with a difficult question, he paused, thought, and answered carefully. When he did not know something, he said so. I have not proved that case yet. Whitmore, seated in the front row, smiled slightly. There was no disappointment in it, only respect. Near the end, Elijah reached the final line of the argument and stopped. A narrow space remained empty on the board. He stared at it for a moment, then wrote the conclusion. The chalk made one soft sound against the surface. That was all. No dramatic applause came immediately. First there was silence, the good kind, the kind that follows an idea landing exactly where it should. Then people began to clap. Elijah turned. His mother was already wiping tears from beneath her glasses. Sophie was smiling. Dr. Lawson nodded once. Whitmore stood last. He walked toward the board after the room began to empty and looked at the finished proof. You know, he said, I spent years thinking a good teacher was someone who always knew more than the student. Elijah placed the chalk on the ledge. And now, Whitmore looked at the final line. Now I think a good teacher knows when to move aside. Elijah smiled. Whitmore stepped back from the board, leaving the space in front of it open. Months earlier, he had used that space to question whether Elijah Brooks belonged. Now he gave it to him without hesitation. The equation had been corrected long ago. What lasted was the harder correction, the one no eraser could make and no theorem could prove. Whitmore had learned to see Elijah not as a scholarship, not as a category, not as someone who needed to justify his place, but as a mind worth hearing. And Elijah had never needed to become cruel to make that lesson clear. He had simply stayed precise, stayed patient, and refused to become smaller. The board was still black. The chalk was still white. But the room no longer saw either one the same way.